before it wakes. Camden has a kind of stillness that makes time feel like it's moving in slow motion. Faded wooden signs hang above the bakery doors. The amber streetlights gradually dim, and the early morning breeze seems in no hurry to go anywhere. The city once called the City of Justice now only echoes that title like a promise no one remembers. Ezekiel Monroe turned the steering wheel, guiding his old Lincoln Town car off Maple Street. It was the kind of car people thought belonged to the past, unless the one driving it made them look twice. Ezekiel was that kind of man. A neatly pressed dark brown suit, a gray fedora, casting a shadow over deep-set eyes, black gloves wrapped around hands, calloused by time. He didn't need anyone to know who he was. Sometimes a person's presence alone is the most complete introduction. A bundle of white flowers was carefully wrapped in brown paper on the passenger seat. They had no scent, no striking appearance, but their presence seemed to quiet the air inside the car. In the trunk was a wooden box, meticulously carved, named Clara Monroe. People often say, memories have no shape, but for Ezekiel, memory had a form, the box he never forgot to bring. Today was a special day. Not a birthday. It's not an anniversary. But one day, Ezekiel had chosen to send off a piece of his past in his way. The last of his relatives, an elderly aunt who once cared for him when his parents were denied medical treatment because of racial discrimination, had just passed away. She left this world quietly, the same way she had lived. Ezekiel didn't speak much. He had never raised his voice in public and never used social media. But he understood the law. He had written those laws. As the former chair of the State Judicial Reform Commission, Ezekiel had once served 3 terms on the state's Supreme Court. But few remembered that now. He didn't mind. People in Camden still remembered him, but not the young officer sitting in a patrol car on the corner of Pine and Jefferson. Derek Calloway, 32, was the kind of officer trained to read situations, or at least that's how he confidently described his instinct. He had once been commended for detecting suspicious behavior, despite no clear evidence. And this morning, in a still half asleep, Camden, his eyes locked onto the Lincoln from afar. Not because it was speeding, not for running a red light. It's just a feeling. It's an old car, but not broken. A black man, elderly, wearing a suit and a fedora. Images that didn't belong together, not in Calloway's subconscious perception. He flipped on his lights. The Lincoln pulled over slowly, as if it had known this would happen. No urgency, no resistance. Ezekiel left the car idle. The whole scene seemed to freeze for a moment. Calloway didn't step out right away. He looked into the rearview mirror, then at his face. His hand moved to rest on his gun, not out of conscious decision, but as a reflex born from training. "Quiet morning," he muttered, then opened his door. The first step he placed on the pavement sounded like the awakening of a morning that had already been pre-written. And in that dawn, prejudice stirred once again in Camden, the city once called the City of Justice. But it wouldn't fade this time, like so many buried incidents before. This time, it would collide with a wall that could not be easily shaken. The silence of a man who carried with him the memory of an entire era of injustice. Setting: early morning, a quiet street cutting through downtown Camden. In the patrol car, Officer Derek Calloway rests his arm on the steering wheel, eyes scanning each passing vehicle, not for a specific signal, but in search of instinct. The radio was still on, but muted. Inside the cabin, the only sound was tapping fingers on the dashboard. Not a melody, but a rhythm of waiting. Calloway, 32, white with piercing eyes, had once been commended for his ability to detect unusual behavior. This morning, he was searching for something he couldn't define, a feeling that something wasn't right. A black vintage Lincoln appeared at the intersection, gliding by like a shadow, silent, unremarkable. But to Calloway, that humility was itself an invitation for suspicion. to clean a car with beat-up government plates. The driver, an old black man, he muttered, narrowing his eyes. There was no violation, no speeding, no broken lights, nothing to trigger a stop. But that's precisely what made Calloway uneasy. He didn't call it profiling. He called it professional instinct. He turned the wheel and slipped into the lane behind the Lincoln, maintaining distance like a hunter tracking prey. Not too close to give himself away, not too far to lose the trail. In the rearview mirror, he saw the driver, an elderly black man in a brown suit, gray fedora and black gloves, sitting upright as if on his way to a commemorative event. His face was calm, eyes forward, never glancing back. A strange sensation crawled into Calloway's palm. Not fear, but powerlessness. Because this man gave him nothing to push back against. The traffic lights shifted. The Lincoln slowly pulled over by the book on time, by the procedure. No argument, no evasion. But it was precisely that composure that unsettled Calloway. He stepped out of this car, hand resting casually on his holster. Not because he felt threatened, but because that was protocol when dealing with unknowns. A soft breeze stirred the trees, kicking up dust onto his boots. Calloway walked toward the Lincoln, eyes sweeping across the window. Inside, the man rolled it down slowly, unbothered. Calloway spoke, voice even, but laced with judgment. "Do you know why I stopped you?" The older man tilted his head, not smiling, not bowing, not angry. He replied, "I assume you have your reason." "I won't try to guess." Calloway frowned. Not confrontational, but not submissive either. His words were gentle, like water, touching glass, not shattering, but leaving a mist that could never be wiped clean. "Where are you headed?" "To lay a piece of history to rest," the man said, still looking straight ahead. Calloway's grip tightened slightly. He was used to suspects who trembled, argued, denied, or snapped. But this man, too calm, too proper, made him feel like he was being tested. No violations, no reason, just something that didn't fit the image in his head. In a government-issued car, an old black man was immaculately dressed and composed. It made him feel the need to verify, because someone like that didn't belong somewhere like this. In that fleeting moment, Calloway didn't see a man on his way to honor a loved one. He only saw something that was out of place. As always, he switched into reflex mode and asked for identification. But what he was about to see would not fit into any scenario he had ever trained for. Setting Camden streets. 8:12 a.m. Early sunlight streamed through rows of trees, casting a golden sheen across the roof of the old Lincoln. A few passers-by glanced over briefly on the sidewalk, then continued walking as if nothing unusual had happened. But for Derek Calloway, this moment was stretching into eternity. The young officer stood in front of the lowered window. He tried to read any sign, nervousness, denial, or even a flicker of reaction. But the man inside didn't move. He sat there like a statue, back straight, leather-gloved hands, resting gently on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, not looking at Calloway, but forward as if before a memorial altar, not a police officer in the middle of the street. "I'm asking you to produce your identification," Calloway repeated, firmer this time. The man turned toward him, not fast, not slow, as if Calloway was the only one out of sync with time. He pulled from his breast pocket a slim black leather wallet, no brand logo, no ornamentation, just the kind of simplicity worn smooth by years. From the wallet, he handed over an ID card. Calloway took it. He looked at the text: Georgia State Supreme Court, Ezekiel J. Monroe, Justice Retired, Criminal Justice Reform Commissioner. A moment of silence. Calloway furrowed his brow. The silver trim on the card had faded, but the emblem of the scales of justice still stood out. He turned the card over and held it up to the light. Nothing suspicious except The fact that it belonged to an old man he had just stopped because something felt off. He sneered slightly, half joking, half probing. Nice-looking badge. Fakes these days are pretty sophisticated. The older man didn't react with anger. He looked at Calloway, a gaze devoid of threat, devoid of submission, but as if he were the one assessing what the officer would do next. If you're unsure, call it in, I won't stop you. The words were soft as the wind, but to Calloway they struck like a stone dropping into a still pond. No one spoke to him like that. No fear, no explanation. It was just an invitation to see if he dared to summon the truth. Calloway returned to his patrol car. The ID card in his hand now felt heavier than usual. He typed the information into the system and is waiting for verification. While the check was processed, he glanced at the rearview mirror. Ezekiel still sat there, unmoved, not looking back. No shouting. Why did you stop me? No asserting I'm a judge. No phone was held up to record the interaction. Nothing to resist. And precisely that composure. That made Calloway feel out of control. The confirmation call hadn't come yet, and the silence was beginning to have weight. Calloway walked back to the driver's side window, his gaze slightly lowered, not sure if it was from the sun or his uncertainty. Where are you headed? Ezekiel answered slowly. To attend a funeral of someone close. And a piece of history. Calloway squinted. Who passed? A quiet breath, not mournful, but like a chapter gently closed. Clara. Monroe. My wife. That name made Calloway flinch slightly. He'd skimmed it once in an old state document. Clara Monroe, former state chief legal officer, a woman who had co-authored criminal justice reform proposals with her husband. But he still didn't say anything, because that didn't match the image he'd read at first glance. And at that moment, Calloway realized something for the first time that morning. This man was not a suspect, but he had made him into one, simply because he didn't look like someone who would talk back. No raised voice, no rationalizing, no visible anger. But each sentence, each glance from Ezekiel was a mirror, reflecting on the very instinct Calloway had always been so proud of, setting still. The same narrow street in Camden. Birds chirped in the distance, interspersed with the occasional car horn. No shouting, no threats. And yet, the atmosphere felt thick, as if every sound had been compressed between two men, standing on the edge of a conversation larger than themselves. Derek Calloway gripped the ID card tighter. His heart beat faster, not out of danger, but because of a strange feeling. The unsettling sense that perhaps he was the one being observed. Nothing in Ezekiel Monroe's demeanor was exaggerated, but his silence didn't feel like submission. It felt like an indictment, yet to be read aloud. Calloway cleared his throat and steadied his voice. I need to conduct further checks. Please step out of the vehicle. Ezekiel said nothing. He slowly opened the door and stepped out. One hand held his hat. The other buttoned his coat. Each gesture composed, deliberate, as if he were preparing to enter a courtroom, not facing a random stop and search. Pop the trunk, please. The older man nodded. No objection. But just before pressing the button, Ezekiel looked Calloway directly in the eyes. If all you find in there is a bouquet and a memory, what will you do afterwards? Calloway froze. He hadn't expected that question. It wasn't threatening, nor was it resentful. It was a moral challenge. A simple question that, if answered wrong, would force him to reckon with himself. Uncertain of how to respond, he just nodded lightly. Ezekiel opened the trunk. Inside were 3 items. A bouquet of white lilies, wrapped in newspaper, still damp with morning dew. An old wool cap faded at the brim, clearly worn over many years. And a square wooden box engraved with the name Clara A. Monroe, 1942, 2023. Calloway stood stunned. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. Maybe a weapon, drugs, something that would justify his initial intuition. But all he saw was grief, and the shame rose in him like a tide. He said nothing. I just stood there amid the wind and the faint rustle of leaves. Ezekiel also said nothing. But that silence, so absolute, struck like a slap across the face. Calloway raised his radio dispatch. I need verification on an ID name. Ezekiel Monroe. Says he's a retired state Supreme Court justice. A female voice from dispatch came through. Copy searching now. A soft click, then silence. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Still no response. Calloway tightened his grip. Usually, it took just a few seconds. So why was it taking so long this time? Or maybe the system wasn't built to process people like Ezekiel Monroe. At that moment, the old black man stood tall. His eyes showed no anger, no hostility. But in them, Calloway saw something more haunting than any accusation: regret. Not regret for himself, but for a society he had once helped to build, only to see still moments like this unfold. No shouting, no condemnation, just a silence, louder than any sound Calloway had ever heard. Setting. A quiet road where dew begins to settle over the grassy shoulders. A patrol car parked crookedly along the curb. The trunk of the old Lincoln is still open. Everything seemed to slow, as if even time was bowing, concerning what would be revealed. Derek Calloway leaned in closer, not to inspect, but because something about the wooden box compelled him to look from up close. It wasn't large nor ornate, just a simple handcrafted box, the kind often found in traditional households where everything had its place, even pain. Beside the box was a neatly folded handkerchief. Next to it, an old black and white photograph. A young black woman in a white dress, smiling brightly beside a tall man. It was Ezekiel in his younger years. Calloway gently touched the edge of the box, then paused and looked up. This is... Ezekiel responded slowly, his voice even and soft, like reciting a prayer repeated hundreds of times. The ashes of Clara, my wife. She passed away 4 days ago. Today is her final memorial. I'm taking her back to where we first met, the Black Church on 9th Street, Camden. Calloway stood upright. He wasn't sure if it was from the cold, the shame, or the wind, but his shoulders trembled slightly. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Monroe. Ezekiel gave a slight nod. No blame, no accusatory glare, just a calm composure, the kind that made Calloway feel even smaller. He returned to his patrol car, hesitating as he picked up the radio. Dispatch, any update on that ID verification? On the other end, a new voice came through. Not the usual dispatcher, but a deeper, unfamiliar male tone. This is the Federal Liaison Unit, confirming Mr. Ezekiel Monroe is a former Chief Justice of the Georgia State Supreme Court. He also served as the Federal Commission on Judicial Reform Chair, Phase 3. A high-priority ID verification protocol has been initiated. Officer Calloway, please state your reason for the stop. Calloway froze. This wasn't just an ID confirmation. It was a slap from the system he had always trusted to shield him. And now that system was asking him for an explanation. Worse yet, his reason for stopping the car had been a feeling something was off. How could he say that out loud here and now to the very man who had helped write the rules he was supposedly enforcing? He stammered, No, violations observed. I was just conducting a routine check. Silence. Then the voice on the other end deepened, acknowledged. We will follow up with the Camden Sheriff's Office. Calloway lowered the radio and turned back. Ezekiel was still standing there, hat in hand, his gaze unchanged. But this time, there was a flicker of sorrow, not for being stopped, but for knowing that even at the end of his life, there were still people who couldn't see the man. Only the skin, the old car, and a subconscious feeling. Calloway spoke softly. "You're free to go." Ezekiel said nothing. He walked to the trunk and closed it gently. His hand lingered on the wooden box one last time, as if affirming something silently to himself. Then he got in the car. Before closing the door, he said one thing. "Thank you for learning something today." And he drove away, the old Lincoln turning beneath a row of tree shadows, leaving Calloway alone, in the silence of a lesson no academy could ever teach. Setting Camden Police Department headquarters, 45 minutes after the traffic stop. The air is still, but phones are ringing like warning bells before a coming storm. In the Internal Affairs Monitoring Room, Lieutenant Marla Briggs, a brown-skinned woman with 22 years of experience and eyes that always saw beneath the surface, picked up the phone just as the third one began to ring. Lieutenant Briggs speaking. Briggs. The voice on the other end didn't bother with formalities. "This is the Federal Justice Office, Special Relations Division. We just received a call from the External Affairs Bureau of the Georgia Supreme Court." Briggs sat upright. "What's the matter?" A Camden officer detained a citizen named Ezekiel Monroe without clear cause. He's a former Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court and co-author of the Federal Civilian Encounter Protocol. The incident is now trending online. Briggs flinched. She opened the patrol car dashcam feed for Unit 274. Frame by frame appeared the traffic stop, the conversation, the worn silver ID badge, the wooden box being opened. Just then, the department's communications director, a red-headed white man named Finley, rushed in. "Lieutenant, this thing's blowing up. There's a video from a bystander. And get this, a former soldier is live-streaming claiming Monroe saved his life in Kuwait. A veteran. Yes, Sergeant Xavier Lowe, Medal of Honor, 2005. His clip got over 300,000 views in under 40 minutes. Briggs turned to her assistant. "Get me a full personnel file on Officer Derek Calloway and contact the mayor's office. Let them know. The storm's coming." Meanwhile, in a modest office inside the federal building in Atlanta, Georgia's Deputy Chief Justice Gwendolyn Harris was also making a call. She had worked with Ezekiel Monroe for over a decade and had never forgotten the fire in his eyes when defending equal rights for the voiceless. "I need to know why was the man who wrote the protocol detained under that same protocol?" A heavy, frosty silence hung on the other end. "Ma'am, according to Officer Calloway, the reason for the stop was professional instinct." Gwendolyn let out a cold, dry laugh, her voice as hard as steel. "Instinct is not a legal basis. If anyone still remembers what Monroe taught, let them remember this. The law isn't for feeling, it's for following." Meanwhile, Ezekiel had arrived at a small church on 9th Street in Camden. He placed the wooden box on a simple wooden stand near the altar, laying the folded handkerchief and the wedding photo over it. The entire space was filled with candlelight, the scent of old wood and jasmine. An older woman approached, gently taking Ezekiel's hand and whispering, "I was worried you'd be late." Ezekiel shook his head slowly. "I'm not late. Just a few people needed to learn how to read time through the eyes of respect." He turned to glance out the church window, where midday sunlight streamed across the quiet street. Somewhere else, an entire system was beginning to shift because of him. Setting on the quiet suburban roadside of Camden, where time seems to have paused. Beside patrol car number 274, Officer Derek Calloway stands frozen, gripping his duty belt tightly, as if he no longer knows what to do next. Calloway had just received a message over the radio. "Lieutenant Briggs wants you back at headquarters, immediately. Do you even know who that man is? Say nothing more. Do nothing more." That last sentence struck like a sentence handed down from above. Calloway turned and looked at Ezekiel Monroe. The man remained by the edge of the road, his hand resting on the closed trunk. No anger, no confusion, only eyes, deep, weary, and filled with a knowingness far beyond anyone Calloway had ever encountered in his career. "I didn't know." Calloway stammered, his gaze flickering between fear and shame. Ezekiel said nothing. He nodded, slowly, lightly, a gesture so subtle it could not be read as agreement, forgiveness, or dismissal. And yet that nod, without explanation, without footnotes, without instruction, became the first seismic blow to Calloway's psyche. Because in a world where authority is wielded through volume and control, that quiet nod was the most profound form of resistance. Calloway stood paralyzed. Everything he had been trained for, how to de-escalate, hold a steady tone, and regain psychological advantage, was now useless. No threats. No hostile gestures. Ezekiel had merely nodded, and it made Calloway feel impossibly small. A group of high school students passed by from a nearby bus stop. One girl whispered, "That man's not scared of anything. He looks like my granddad when the doctor told him the diagnosis." A boy holding a phone whispered as he filmed, "Hey, that's Mr. Monroe. I remember him from a talk at our school in 8th grade." Calloway heard it all. Every word hit him like a pin through fabric. Slow, sharp, undeniable. This was the same man he had stopped moments ago, believing his instinct could detect a threat. And in that moment, Calloway realized something none of his training officers had ever taught him. There are people whose dignity alone outweighs any badge or authority you wear. Ezekiel stepped into the car. The Lincoln's engine started quiet, steady, not hurried, and not flustered. And Calloway remained where he was, with nothing more to say and nothing more to do. Only silence remained, like an indictment, unwritten yet fully understood. Setting: a quiet roadside bend near the town of Camden. What should have been an uneventful morning turn has become the stage for a wordless confrontation whose echoes are spreading bit by bit. The faded Lincoln rolled away, leaving behind an emptiness. No one immediately entered. But in that silence, eyes began to open. A middle-aged woman standing near the bus stop, grocery bag in hand, gasped, "Oh my God, that was him, Judge Monroe." It wasn't loud, but like a spark falling into dry grass. It ignited something. A white teenager in a backward cap turned to his friend. "That guy spoke at my sister's graduation, right? Didn't he help write the reform laws for our state?" "Yeah, him. I remember. He told a story about his mom getting kicked out of school because of segregation. I cried, man." A grizzled veteran in a faded jacket stepped toward Calloway, his voice raspy. "You know he once saved someone's life during that boarding house fire in '96. I was there. He wouldn't leave, even when the firemen said to evacuate." Calloway didn't respond. His eyes were still fixed in the direction the car had vanished. But in his mind, every voice, every stare, that man slammed down like a hammer. Because now he understood this moment was no longer just between him and Ezekiel Monroe. A teenager replayed the last moments on his phone. No violence, no shouting. Just an older man in a fedora handing over his ID and nodding simple. Yet more than 3 million people had watched the clip in just 36 hours. Because what made the video go viral wasn't action. It was the look in Monroe's eyes when his dignity was questioned, and how he wasn't angry, didn't condemn, just looked as if holding up a mirror to society itself. That evening, the local news led with the headline, "Who is Ezekiel Monroe?" Archived footage and records followed. Former state Supreme Court Justice, architect of statewide police conduct policies, keynote speaker at over 200 educational events across the country, founder of the Teach the Law to Children initiative. The reporter ended with, and this morning he was asked to open his trunk by someone operating under the code of conduct he helped write. An older woman called into a radio station. Voice breaking. I taught for nearly 40 years. There was a boy named Ezekiel. I always sat in the back reading the Constitution. I never imagined that one day he'd be the reason the whole country stops to look at itself. No one was shouted at. No one was arrested. No one was assaulted. But all of Camden fell silent, as if all at once people realized they had witnessed something beyond injustice, an awakening. And the one who sparked it with just a look, a moment of silence, a simple nod, was an older man who had lived more than half a life, never needing applause. Setting. 2 days after the incident, a video clip no one thought would spark a movement has now swept across the country. Camden, once quietly praised as a model of fair justice, is beginning to crack from within. The Camden Police Department is drowning in emails, faxes, and phone calls. The Federal Department of Justice has formally requested a full report. The questions come in waves. Why was a former Supreme Court justice's car stopped without cause? On what grounds did the officer request a trunk search? Was there body camera footage? Was there an audio recording? Why wasn't the ID verified on the spot? In the conference room, Camden Police Chief Douglas Fenwick, gray-haired, long hailed for his lectures on police reform, stood frozen in front of a 52-second video clip. In it, Monroe stands still. Calloway looks unsettled, and the silence slices like a blade. A young officer whispered, "Worse than any punch," was that nod. On national television, panel discussions aired non-stop. Professor Harriet Lang of Howard University Law School stated, "If someone who chaired the state's ethics commission can be treated like a suspect, this isn't a system that needs reform. It's a system that needs rewriting from the ground up." A senior journalist from the Washington Post published a column titled, "Morality Doesn't Need a Name Tag." Ezekiel Monroe's nod made a town look at itself on Good Morning America. 3 guests appeared: a lawyer, a former police officer, and a sociology student. The student shared, "I was working on my thesis about the power of nonverbal symbols in the history of anti-racism, but now I'm scrapping it. I can graduate with full marks just by writing about those 52 seconds." Camden was no longer quiet. A group of high schoolers created posters that read, "If he had to open his trunk, none of us can afford to close our eyes." A local barbershop posted a photo of Monroe on the mirror beneath a line that read, "A real man doesn't need to shout to silence the world." At a small cafe, a man whispered, "I used to think things like this only happened elsewhere. Not in Camden. Not here. But now I realize maybe Camden is just where it needed to begin." That same night, a message from the head of the Federal Department of Justice was delivered directly to Monroe's hands via a former aide. "Judge Monroe, if you are willing, we would like you to return, not to argue, but to help redefine." Camden had been shaken. But the aftershocks were only beginning, and the most powerful people weren't speaking for the first time in years. They were listening. Setting: Officer Derek Calloway's home on the outskirts of Camden, a place once peaceful, now stifling under the gaze of those he loves most. Derek opened the front door close to midnight. The lights were still on. He had hoped his wife was asleep, but no. Tina, his young wife. An elementary school teacher sat quietly on the couch, hands clenched together, not saying a word. At the dining table, little Micah, their 8-year-old son, was halfway through coloring a picture. A man in a suit wearing a fedora standing in front of a car next to a police officer pointing at him. In the drawing, the police officer had no face. Derek froze. Tina looked at him, her voice trembling slightly. "I got a bunch of anonymous messages today. They sent me a link to the clip. What am I supposed to say to my students?" "To our son." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but stayed silent. Micah walked over and handed his father a handwritten sheet. "A good person Doesn't make others worry when they walk into a room, the boy mumbled. It's my first quote, writing homework, Dad. The teacher said to pick something we believe is true. Derek felt like a mirror had just been held up before him, not by the public, but by his blood inside the place that was supposed to be safest. He asked softly, Do you know who the man in the video is? Micah nodded. Grandpa's friend. Mom said he helped lots of people. Never yelled at anyone, Tina added. I met him once when I was teaching at the community center. He stood in the back of the class, said nothing. Just looked at the kids like they could change the world. Derek turned away. He saw his reflection in the living room mirror, a young man in a crisp uniform, with confused, hollow eyes. He asked, Do you think I'm a bad person? Tina stayed quiet for a long moment. I think you're trying to answer a question you didn't even know you'd asked yourself. Before bed, Micah whispered to his mother, Can Dad say sorry to him? Tina didn't answer, but both adults in the house understood. Some questions children ask not to hear an answer, but to make grown-ups look in the mirror. In the darkness, Calloway lay on his side, eyes blank, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he didn't see Ezekiel Monroe's face. He saw his face reflected in his son's eyes, setting. A quiet wave sweeps across America, not of protests or slogans, but of children's questions. The week following the incident in Camden schools around the region began noticing something unusual. In classrooms from elementary to high school, students started asking questions not found in any textbook. If you follow the rules but end up hurting someone, is it still right? Is staying silent in front of something wrong the same as helping it happen? Why are polite people suspected but loud ones protected? Who teaches police how to identify danger? At a high school in Raleigh, a civics and society teacher had to stop her lecture midway. A student named Lynn of Asian descent raised her hand and asked if someone like Mr. Ezekiel Monroe can still be stopped on the side of the road. Then what do we have to do to be trusted? No one in the classroom could answer. At an elementary school in Baltimore, teachers organized a session called The Unwritten Questions, a class with no grades and no right or wrong answers. Just slips of paper where students were encouraged to write down what they wondered about society. A fifth-grade boy wrote, If I smile and call someone by their name, but they're still scared, is it because of my skin color? A little girl wrote, Why aren't old people with glasses, nice clothes, and nice cars trusted to be kind? A white student wrote, If I go somewhere with my dad who's a cop, should I ask him about Mr. Monroe? On social media, the hashtag #OurQuestions began trending. A teacher in Portland shared, I used to think teaching kids how to speak up was enough. Now I realize I must teach them to be silent at the right time, to listen to those who've never been heard. A high school student was unexpectedly invited to speak at a state education department press conference. She stood at the mic, hands trembling, holding a piece of paper. I'm not from Camden. I've never met Mr. Monroe. But I've met many people like him in their eyes, their patience, and how they stay silent when doubted. Her voice cracked. Adults always ask us who we want to be when we grow up. But I want to ask, who do adults want to be after everything that's happened? The room fell silent. From Camden. Ezekiel. Monroe did not speak, but he had become a voice inside the minds of an entire generation. Not those searching for answers, but those just beginning to learn how to ask the right questions. Setting. 6 months after the incident in Camden, Ezekiel Monroe has vanished from the media, but his name or his presence has never left society's collective mind. Camden changed gradually without noise. At police headquarters, new procedural guide posters were pinned across briefing rooms. One section stood out. Avoid using instinct when there is no clear data. Choose dignity first. In the newly revised officer training curriculum, the introduction opened with an anonymous quote. You can control others with power, but you only win hearts through silence at the right moment. No author was named, but everyone knew it came from Ezekiel Monroe. In state courts, a slight shift occurred. On legal documents, instead of listing defendant name, race, gender, it now reads defendant, name, occupation, or social role. A subtle but meaningful effort to remove racial bias from first impressions. A young female lawyer said on television, "We didn't rewrite the law. We rewrote the lens through which we see before the law is applied." At the North Carolina State School of Law, a new elective was launched titled Moral Silence. It wasn't taught through textbooks. Instead, students sat and listened to audio clips without voices, only sounds. The sound of wind on Camden's roadside. The ignition of an old Lincoln engine. The soft thud of flowers resting in a wooden trunk. The sound of a nod unseen but universally felt. A final-year law student said, "It's the first class that made me realize I need to learn to be a person before I can be a lawyer." Ezekiel Monroe never gave interviews. He never joined any panel. Rumors said he moved to a small town near the mountains without a television signal. A journalist once reached his cabin. He didn't find Ezekiel, but hanging outside the wooden porch was a carved sign that read, "Don't ask me what I've changed. Let your heart change if you're silent long enough." 1 year after the Camden incident, the winning entry came from an 11-year-old boy in Milwaukee at the National Creative Writing Contest for elementary students. The essay was titled, "My Hero is the One Who Said Nothing." He wrote, "My hero didn't save anyone from a fire, didn't beat the villain, didn't raise his fists. My hero stood there calm and made the whole world look at itself." At the end, the boy added, "I don't remember his name, but I remember his eyes." Ezekiel Monroe stepped away from history's spotlight, but he never left the hearts of society, learning again how to see through quiet and kindness.